Okay, so this is going to be a slightly different talk than what perhaps you've been hearing in this course. It's going to be looking at the problem solving in general, how hard or how easy it is, and of course some of the problems you have encountered in this course, of course, are easy. Some of them are not so easy. So this gives a bigger perspective of the lay of the land in terms of the complexity of problems. I'm going to be looking at two types of problems. One, which are easy to solve, and two, which may not be easy to solve, but if somebody tells me a solution, I can easily verify if the solution is correct. Okay, and how these two types of problem relate to each other, and what are the consequences of that relationship is what will be discussed in here. So feel free to stop me and ask any questions if you have any clarifications. The title of the talk is the P not equal to NP hypothesis. The two types of problem I just mentioned is one type is represented by the symbol P, the other type is represented by the symbol NP. Are some of you familiar with this notation? All of you? Not everyone. Okay. Never mind. I will define this as we go along. Let's start with some motivation on why these two types of problems are important. And here is an optimization problem which I'm sure you have come across, called the traveling salesman problem. Everybody familiar with this problem? Right? So I don't have to describe it. It is a hard to solve problem. In fact, even if so a salesman has to visit all the cities in a map in the shortest possible distance. Even if we relax the problem a bit and say, okay, let's not worry about shortest possible, let's give an a priori bound and ask to find a tour whose distance is within that bound. So in this example which I just flashed, this is a map of India with a lot of cities marked in, and the salesman has to cover all of this, and we can say that the traversal has to be at most 9,000 kilometers long. Even with this relaxation, it is not clear how to find a solution easily. We know how to find a solution, but all the methods known to find a solution end up taking a long time. In fact, such a long time that is not worthwhile pursuing it. The salesman, after all, why does he want to minimize the length of the tour? Because it saves time, right? That's why the length of the tour is to be minimized. But if finding that best tour takes more time than traversing all the cities, then clearly is not a worthwhile task to do that. And unfortunately, that is the situation at present for this problem. But this problem, although is hard to solve, yet it has one interesting property, which is that if somebody gives me or gives a salesman along with the map a suggested tour also, then for the salesman it's very easy to check if this suggested tour meets all the conditions. There are just two conditions to be verified. One, that it visits all the cities on the map, and two, that its total distance is within the given bound. And that's easy to check. So this is a problem of the kind where a given or a proposed solution is easy to verify, although the solution may not be easy to find. Yeah, this is a problem where finding a solution may be hard, but verifying the solution is easy, definitely. So there seems to be a differentiation here between finding a solution and verifying the solution, which is not a very surprising differentiation, because we do encounter many problems in our day-to-day lives where finding a solution is harder than verifying the correctness of a solution. Here is another example, and that certainly is a problem that you do encounter often: the Sudoku puzzle. I don't have to explain this. It's a 9x9 grid with some square filled in, and there are a set of rules which govern how to solve this. Has any of you ever wondered why 9x9 grid?
From 0 to 9.
Yes, but why only 9x9 grid? If you think about it for a moment, you will realize that grid can also be n square by n square for any n. For example, it can be a 4x4 grid, 9x9, which is what the Sudoku puzzles are, but 16x16, 25x25, and so on. And the rules remain essentially the same, that every row and every column has to be filled by numbers from 1 to n square, and every n by n subgrid in an n square by n square grid has to be filled again with the numbers from 1 to n square. Okay. Now, why do you think you've never encountered a 4x4 grid or a 16x16 grid?
Because of time difficulty and the this time complexity of solving that problem.
Yes, that's certainly the primary reason. But why not 4x4? That's too easy. 4x4 becomes so easy that nobody will really bother trying to solve this. The reason people get attracted to Sudoku puzzle is that the solution is often very challenging to find. But that also suggests that if even with 9x9 grid, the solution can sometimes take a long time to find, it will get much more complicated if you have a 16x16 grid, and even worse if you have a 25x25 grid. Correct? So here is another problem, therefore, where finding a solution is not easy. We can certainly conclude that. But at the same time, if somebody gives me a solution, that is, somebody fills up all the grids and asks me to check if the solution is correct, that is trivial. You can just check rows, columns, and subgrids, and you're done. So another example of a problem where finding a solution is more difficult than verifying its correctness. Has any of you?
Is it not easy to solve 10 by 10?
No, you can't define a 10 by 10 grid as per the rules. You can only have a
16 by 16.
16. You can have a 16 by 16 grid. Yes.
Can't be solved.
No, it can. Some of them can be solved easily. I mean, if some see in the puzzle, many of the squares are pre-filled with numbers. If nearly all squares are already filled with numbers, then it becomes easy to solve. But there will be cases where it will be not easy to solve. It will take a long time. Even 9 by 9 cases take a long time. So just to give you a pictorial flavor of what a large Sudoku puzzle will look like, here is a 25 by 25 Sudoku puzzle. There are people in this world who actually do try to solve this. And this is pulled from the Puzzle Magazine website. So there are more examples of this there. And this looks quite formidable. Just trying to fill this up properly is certainly going to tax the brain and take a long time. Okay. But these two problems therefore share this common characteristic that finding a solution seems difficult, but verifying the solution is easy. Is this true for all problems? No. In fact, here is a problem which this is my invention, just a modification of Sudoku puzzle, which I am calling the row puzzle. The modification is that you drop the column and subgrid rules. Only the row rule exists, that is, every row must be filled with numbers from 1 to n square. Now, if such a puzzle is given, even for a large n, let's say 100 by 100 grid, is it hard to solve? It's very easy to solve. Just go row by row, see which numbers are missing in the row, and fill them up in whichever order you want. That's it. So here is an example of a problem where finding a solution is as easy as verifying the correctness of solution. So the point of this example was simply to state that there are times when finding is same as easy as verifying, but there are times where findings is more difficult, appears significantly more difficult than verifying. And at a more philosophical level, this is the difference between discovery of something novel or something new and verification of the discovery. We often have these examples of scientists who, after a long struggle, discovered some remarkable phenomenon. And once that phenomenon is discovered, then subsequently everybody can replicate that phenomenon easily. Because that is, once a discovery has been made, everybody else knows how to repeat that process. So, intuitively, it is, I think all of us will agree that discovery as a mechanism or as a process is not very clear. That is what is the process through which one makes a discovery? There is no clear-cut, well laid out process. Everybody has to, depending on the problem, find a perspective of it, chart perhaps a new path, and then find it. A priori, you don't know what the process to follow. As opposed to that, verifying the solution, that's a mechanical process. Right? There is a step 1, step 2, step 3, do this, and you verify the correctness. So that's at an intuitive level, the difference between this discovery and verification. One is a mechanical process, the other seems to require creativity or some intuitive spark or whatever you may want to call it. But these are just words. These are not precisely defined or at least mathematically rigorous explanations. You can only state these things at an intuitive level. The mathematical formulation of this is required to formally prove that there are problems where discovery is more difficult or the finding a solution is more difficult than verifying the correctness. And that's a very important question, because while we may intuitively feel that this is true, unless it is formally proven, there is always a doubt that maybe it is not. And if it is not, then there are very interesting consequences of this, which I will discuss shortly. So, the question of formally proving this difference between discovery and verification is what is represented as the P versus NP problem. But in order to formalize this, we need to formalize many of the phrases that I have used so far. I have said a problem is hard to solve, easy to solve. Well, just to distinguish between hard and easy, we have to formally define what it means for a problem to be easy to solve. Well, naturally the definition would be that a problem is easy to solve if its solution can be found quickly. But there are still imprecise explanations here, because how do you find the solution? How do you compute the solution? That also has to be formally defined, the process of computing the solution. Also, how do you define quickly? I mean, you can't just leave it as a vague notion that, okay, it's quick if it can be done in quick enough. I mean, that's really not a proper explanation. We can't even say, okay, if it is quick if it can be done in 2 minutes. No, what if it can be done in 3 minutes? That's also quick. Also, that number of the time will actually depend on, especially if you are using computers, the processing speed of the computer. If a higher processing speed computer is used, it can probably, time would come down. So, giving a specific value to the time to defining quickness is not really a good idea. So, we have to do it carefully. Well, fortunately, it's all done. So, yeah, I'm probably going through the thing that all of you know already, but let's quickly go through this. The process of computation is captured through an algorithm. This is a very precise step-by-step process given by the algorithm, and this is already formalized as a Turing machine and through several other models long time ago, almost 100 years ago. So we have a very good understanding of what it means by computation, that how do you compute something. Yes?
So that means which one we are calling algorithm, that is the process of verification, not the process of investigation.
Yeah, that process is an algorithm. But when you
Process of solving, that is not called algorithm. Algorithm is verification.
see the process, any process which is well defined is called an algorithm. Okay. When we try to use this notion to capture finding a solution and verifying the solution, for both we will be looking for algorithms. Okay, for finding a solution, okay, what is the best algorithm? For verifying, what is the best algorithm? Then we will say, okay, for verifying we can find an algorithm which runs very fast. But for finding a solution, all our algorithms take a long time. And that will make the distinction between the two clear. Now with Turing machine model, we can also give a very nice definition of the time. It is simply the number of steps taken by the Turing machine to conclude its computation. And this number of steps is independent of processing speed or anything else. And using this, we define the notion of efficient computation or a fast algorithm as one that takes time n to the some constant, where n is the size of the input. See, in a problem, let's say a Sudoku problem, the input size will vary. If it is a 9 by 9 grid, it's a small input size. 16 by 16 grid will give a larger input size. 25 by 25 will be even bigger. And the bigger the input is, it will, even just to read the input is going to take more time. So we have to express time as a function of input size. It cannot be independent of input size. Now, just to read the input, you will take, if the input size is n, then you just to read the input, you will take n steps. So that is the minimum time required to solve any problem. And what we are saying here in this definition is just that little more than that. Not n, give it n square, n cube, n to the 5, some power of n as the time taken or allowed to be taken to solve the problem. So if that is a problem that admits such a solution, such a Turing machine, is called a polynomial time solvable problem. Okay? So this notion, now that we have formalized this, we can now use the formalization to define these two classes of problems, P and NP. P is very simple. It contains all problems that can be solved efficiently. That is, that by our formalization, it means that all those problems for which there exists a Turing machine which can solve this problem in polynomial time. It's called polynomial time because the time taken is a polynomial in the input size. Okay? So that is the class of all efficiently solvable problems, the class P. Fine. There is a caveat here that we all need to be aware of, that technically speaking, not all problems in P are quickly solvable in the sense that we understand fast computation, because to take an example, suppose there is a problem that takes n to the 1000 steps to solve. Then this problem, even on input size 2, that is n equals 2, it will take 2 to the 1000 steps. Now 2 to the 1000 steps is a staggeringly large number. It is certainly not efficient. So therefore this definition which I have just given is not the perfect definition of efficiently solvable problems. But this is the best definition we can give, which one captures all efficiently solvable problems of interest to us, and two, it has some nice closure properties so that we can analyze this class reasonably well. The reason why it captures all the problems of interest to us is that while it is theoretically possible for a problem to take so many steps to solve, in practice, the problems that we get or the problems that we are interested in solving have a very interesting structure, which is that either they are not solvable efficiently at all, so they are outside P, or if they are efficiently solvable, then the constant is not large. In fact, if my memory serves me right, the largest constant for all the interesting problems that have been discovered so far, which are in P, the largest constant is 8. So within n to the 8 steps, you can solve it. And that's pretty nice. I mean, n to the 8th step is certainly efficiently solved. So it's a very interesting phenomena. It seems that the nature understands polynomial time complexity in the sense that if a problem in nature is efficiently solvable, it is really efficiently solvable. And if it is not efficiently solvable, of course it is not efficiently solvable. So there is nothing in between them. We can artificially construct problems of this kind, but they don't exist in nature. Okay, so with this caveat, we can safely take P to be the class of all efficiently solvable problems. Now, examples of problems in P? Yes.
Say we have C equal to 8
Yes.
and say we have the size of input as say 100.
Yes.
So the time complexity in that case will become 100 to the power 8.
Yes.
So that may take days to solve.
No, that's 10 to the 16 steps.
Yeah, 10 to the 16.
10 power 16 steps is
Say we have a processing power of 10 to the 8 per second.
we have much faster processing power, but let's assume that. Okay.
Yeah, so in that case it will take a lot of time, right? How do we
Yes.
solve in that case it is efficient?
Yes, that's a good point. So for large enough input size, in fact, it will not be very efficiently solvable, correct? But this is to be expected, that the larger the input size is, the more time it's going to take. Even for a problem of, let's say, which takes time n steps, which takes n steps to solve, which is best possible. If the input size is 10 to the 20, then it's going to take a long time to solve. Okay, so that is that's a given. What we are measuring here is that as a function of input size, so that is the time. Suppose the time it takes to write down the input, is that time or thereabout sufficient to solve the problem also? That is what we are measuring. Okay, so in that sense, we classify this as efficiently solvable. But your point is still valid that for large input sizes, it may still take a long time to solve.
What is actually input size? What do you mean by input size?
Input size is like in the example problem, let's take here. Okay, let's look at this. Addition, multiplication of numbers. Input size, so the problem is to add two numbers. The input size will be total number of digits in these two numbers which are given to you. The larger the numbers are, the bigger is the input size, and the more time it will take to add.
Steps means in this case?
Steps would be when you can design a Turing machine which will, or an algorithm which will do this addition for you. How many steps are taken by that algorithm?
If there is one step means that is calculation step.
Yes, calculation steps.
Alternatively, like how do we reach at the conclusion that a polynomial kind of a time complexity is like suitable? Like, why not a linear kind of?
Yeah, linear is, of course, you always would want a linear, but unfortunately it doesn't happen. Like, for example, this is the one. Multiplying two matrices. You are given two n by n matrices, you want to multiply them. There is no linear time algorithm known for this. But little more than linear is available. And now you would say multiplying matrices is certainly efficiently solvable. Correct? So that's why linear, just taking linear is not good enough. Well, here is another example. This is comes from a different domain, that is, given a map and given two cities, what is the shortest path between the two cities? This is somewhat different from the traveling salesman problem, but similar in nature. This is efficiently solvable. This is more of a optimization problem. Sure, all of you familiar with linear programming? Yeah, so this is effectively linear programming. Linear programming is efficiently solvable, although the exponent there is slightly large. Okay, so the row puzzle that I had invented, that's also efficiently solvable. So a very large collection of problems lie in P. We would like all the problems to be in P. Well, not always. I'll come to an example where there are problems which we don't want to be in P. But generally speaking, we would like the problems to be efficiently solvable so that we can solve them. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen. There are problems which are not in P. Many of those problems lie in the class, the other class, which is NP. So NP is the class of all problems whose solutions can be verified efficiently. Finding a solution may take a long time, but verifying a solution is easy. And this can be defined simply by using the formalism we have already done. One is that the size of the solution should not be much bigger than the size of the input. Because if solution size is much bigger than input size, then just to write down the solution, it will take a long time. So we impose this condition that solution size is bounded by a polynomial in input size. And second, given the solution of the problem, verifying the correctness should be easy, which we have already said, or we have already defined or formalized it. So we would say that problem of verifying the correctness of solution is in P, because P contains all efficiently solvable problems. So any problem that satisfies these two properties, we will say that problem belongs to the class NP. Okay. So NP captures all those problems whose solutions can be verified quickly. And here are examples of problems in NP. Everything which is in P is obviously in NP, because if you can find the solution quickly, you can verify it also. The Sudoku puzzle in an NP. This is also a optimization problem, but this cannot be solved using linear programming. In fact, it requires integer linear programming, which is hard to do. This is an NP. Traveling salesman problem, which is just described, is an NP. And here is an interesting example that if you are given a statement of a theorem and you are asked to find a proof. Now finding the proof is in NP, because if somebody has given the proof, verifying the correctness of proof is easy. Okay, so the big question here is P not equal to NP? If P is equal to NP, this would mean that any problem that you can solve, that any problem whose solution you can verify efficiently, you can also solve efficiently. Okay? Do you think that is possible? Sorry? The statement, if P, let's understand what P equals to NP implies. NP has all problems whose solutions can be verified quickly. And P equals NP means that problem is also in P. So any problem whose solution can be verified quickly can also be solved quickly. Is that possible? Doesn't look likely, right? Because if this happens, it would mean that, again at a philosophical level, that creativity can be mechanized, right? This finding a solution which requires some intuition or creativity, we don't really need that. We can have a computer which will find the solutions for efficiently for any problem that we did of this kind. This would make many people jobless, including mathematicians, because mathematicians' job is to find proofs of theorems. Now, if that can be mechanized, then computers can replace all the mathematicians. But it would also have some very interesting consequences. One of them is that the world will become free of diseases. Why? Well, let's think of the problem of discovering a cure for a disease. It requires, given a description of a disease, the cure is that you come up with some formula, synthesize that formula, put it in a tablet or whatever form, and give it to the patient and see it gets cured. Right? Now, suppose somebody gives you a tablet which is claimed to cure this disease. How do you verify if this claim is correct? Well, catch 100 patients suffering from that disease and give them the tablet and watch them over like a month or so. Are they getting cured or not? Are there side effects or not? Okay, if nothing happens, if they get cured, that means the tablet is the right cure for the disease. So that is efficient. I mean, within a, let's say, 100 odd days, we can do that. Fine. So if P was equal to NP, then that tablet, the formulation of that tablet, what the formula is, given a disease, the right tablet for that can be discovered quickly. Right? Like it takes 100 days to verify, maybe 200 days to discover. That's also fine. So anytime a new disease comes, within a short, like a few months, we can come up with a cure of that disease. So that would be a pretty remarkable situation. So it will change the world in a positive way, but it will also change the world in negative way, because there are some problems which we don't want to be solved efficiently. One of them is used in cryptography. When you make this online payments, so then your credit card or whatever details, bank details, are first encrypted and then sent over network. Because if they are not encrypted, somebody listening to the network can find out the details and then use or misuse your bank account. So this encryption is done in such a way that only those at the receiving end can decrypt it. So the problem of decryption for the person at the receiving end is efficiently solvable, that is in P. But problem of encryption or decryption for anybody in the middle is in NP. Now if P were equal to NP, then that problem will be in P. So that anybody in the middle can efficiently decode it and find out all your bank details, credit card information. So the consequence of this would be that the entire online financial system will collapse. We will have to go back to doing everything on paper. Internet will become completely insecure. So we would only be using internet to get information. That's it, nothing else. So all these nice, convenient ways of doing, shopping on Amazon, booking tickets on Make My Trip, everything will be done and over with. So again, this is a very different world we will end up with if P were equal to NP. There are some big positives to this, there are some big negatives to this also. So it's certainly going to be a very interesting world. But it's quite likely that that world doesn't exist, because it's very widely believed that P is not equal to NP. Just like many of you said that it's unlikely. That's a general belief that P is not equal to NP. Intuitively it makes sense, because I think most people believe that the process of discovery is inherently more complex than the process of verification. And so there are times when discovery is going to take a long time. The history has shown us certainly that to be the case. Yet, I mean, this is all conjecture. These are all conjectures, right? P equal to NP, P not equal to NP. Just to settle this, we need a formal proof that P is not equal to NP. That is yet to come. We don't till date have a proof that P is not equal to NP. In fact, it's clearly a very important problem to solve, and it was listed as one of the 7 millennium problems at the beginning of this century that mathematicians should try to solve. Of course, there is anybody who solves this also gets $1 million. But I won't advise to solve this problem if you want to get $1 million. Right? There are much easier ways of making $1 million than this. Okay. So, I hope I have given you an overall picture of what this problem is, why is it interesting, and why we want to prove that P is not equal to NP. I'm sure if you look back and think about the problems that have been discussed in this course or will be discussed later on in this course, you can classify most of them in either in P or in NP. There are the problems in NP, like traveling salesman problem. They are hard to solve, but still they are very practical problems. A salesman wants to solve that problem in order to get a good tour. So alternative techniques are used in that case. The best or the most popular one is to get an approximate solution. That if, okay, forget about optimal solution, get something close to optimal. That's also good enough. And fortunately for traveling salesman problem, there is indeed an efficient algorithm which produces a solution which is close to optimal. So that can be used. But coming back to this, it remains a very interesting problem to solve, a challenge to the mathematical community as to how to formally prove that P is not equal to NP. Yes?
So, when we apply some multiple heuristics to solve a problem to get acceptable solution, how
Yeah.
do you say that it is close to optimal because we don't know where is the optimal?
That's right. That heuristic is a generic way which can give you a solution, but you don't know how close it is to optimal.
We say that it is close, we don't know.
In traveling salesman problem, there is a technique which guarantees that the solution you will get is within a factor of 2 to the optimal solution. Now, in order to prove that guarantee, you have to do some bit of mathematical analysis of that solution and come up with a proof that within a factor. In fact, today we know algorithms which can solve traveling salesman problem efficiently within a factor of 1.001. So really close to optimal.
Then how much time?
The time grows the more close to optimal you go to. So 1.001 will take you maybe n to the 6th time. So there is a trade-off. So you, depending on how much time you can spend to find a good solution, you tweak this parameter and find that approximate solution.
2010 nearly, IIT Kanpur had claimed to have solved it, come very close to have solved this particular problem.
Traveling salesman problem?
No, P equals NP problem. And there was a feedback in the community saying that IIT Kanpur actually solved this particular problem.
No, not IIT Kanpur. I've been here since 2010 certainly.
So
I
we
do-
got it here, and then I actually read the paper, just happened to read some news also, not the paper.
No, so there is perhaps you are referring to the solution which was claimed by person named Vinay Devlalikar. He actually at that time was in US, in quite likely in IBM, and he claimed a solution or a proof that P is not equal to NP, but that proof turned out to be incorrect. Okay, so now, okay, like next over 15-20 minutes, let me tell you that what has been done so far in trying to prove this, that P not equal to NP. See, at an intuitive level, this problem or this distinction between discovery and verification has been around for centuries. But the formal definition of P, NP, and therefore a formalization of this question was only done in early 1970s. So about 40 plus years. And since then, attempts have been made to prove P not equal to NP. None of them, of course, have succeeded. What has happened, it's not that no progress has been made, progress has been made, but that progress is of the kind which says that if you try to prove it in this fashion, it's not going to work. If you try to prove in this other fashion, it's not going to work. So all the progress that we have made, therefore, is of this negative kind, that by doing this you can definitely not prove. We don't know by doing what we can prove. So this is what I am calling barriers, that we have discovered a few, actually two major barriers, in which say that if you try to prove it in this fashion, forget about it, you are wasting your time. Okay. Let me describe one such barrier to you. It's a very interesting description. It's called the relativization barrier. Now, to understand this, you all will have to do a thought experiment, which is that let's assume there is an algorithm A. Okay, I'm just calling it A. And that algorithm may take a long time to execute, but we'll not bother. We will pretend that algorithm is getting executed in one step. So whatever input we give to that algorithm, in next step we get the output. So this is only a thought experiment. It has nothing to do with reality. Okay, just pretend that it is the case. Such algorithms, when you pretend this thing about an algorithm, that algorithm is called an oracle. Now that's inside of a name is borrowed from this ancient notion of oracles who would sit on top of mountains. You go and ask any questions to them and you can get the answer. So this algorithm is like an oracle. You give it any input, instantaneously you get back the output. Okay. Now, continuing with our thought experiment, suppose we have this algorithm A as an oracle. Now, the question we ask is, can we compute more things efficiently? Quite possibly, yes. Algorithm A may actually take a long time to compute. For example, suppose algorithm A was providing solutions of Sudoku puzzle. Now, if algorithm A is given as oracle, I can certainly solve Sudoku puzzle efficiently in one step actually. So now the problems that I can solve efficiently again in this imaginary world is certainly bigger than the problem I can solve efficiently in the real world. Correct? You can also view this computation as, this is an imaginary world. So it's let's say it's happening in a different universe. It's an imaginary universe, it's happening in that world. Now, in that world, we can again define precisely the class as P and NP. P again is the class of all problems that can be solved efficiently. NP is again the class of all problems whose solutions can be verified efficiently. Now, these two classes will change. They will most likely become bigger than what they were in the real world. So, to distinguish this, these two classes, we will refer to them as P to the A and NP to the A. This represents the fact that A is an oracle, and with respect to this oracle, P to the A is class of all efficiently solvable problems. So, in this imaginary world, we can again pose the same question: is PA not equal to NPA? Right? And we can ask for answer. Now we have infinitely many worlds available here. Change the oracle, you get a different world, and ask the question in that world. So there is this infinite class of imaginary worlds where we can pose this question. Of course, there is a real world where we are. Now, in 1975, that is very early on, just within a few years of formally defining this problem, Baker, Gill and Solovay showed that there is a world A, there is an oracle A, where P is equal to NP. And there is another oracle B, or there is another world where P is not equal to NP. So both possible answers exist depending on which imaginary world we pick. Okay. What does it say? I mean, this is fine to know. As a curiosity, it is good. Okay, there is a world where P is NP, equal to NP. There is another world where P is not equal to NP. But does it say anything about the real world? Nothing. Right? It doesn't imply P equal to NP in real world. It doesn't imply P not equal to NP in the real world. But it does imply something about real world. What is that? It implies that any proof that works equally well in all these imaginary worlds, including the real world, that proof cannot show, or any claimed proof that works equally well in all the worlds, that claimed proof cannot show P equal to NP or P not equal to NP in our world. Because if it works equally well in all worlds and it is showing P equal to NP, it would mean P equal to NP in all the worlds. But that's false. We know a world where P is not equal to NP. Similarly, no proof can show P not equal to NP in our world, which works equally well in all the worlds for the same reason. So what we learn from this is any proof technique which can be translated to all these worlds is worthless if you want to use it to prove P not equal to NP. Do you follow me? Or is there any confusion here? Okay. So there are many proof techniques known. By proof technique I mean methodology. Okay, if you want to prove this theorem, try this. Use this approach. Now, if an approach, take a particular approach, if that approach translates to all the worlds, which I have just defined, then that approach certainly is never going to give me a proof of P not equal to NP. Because if that does, then it would give me a proof of P not equal to NP in this world also. But I know for sure that that is not the case. So what we learned from this is that all the proof techniques which work perfectly in all the worlds are useless for us. Well, that certainly is a learning, but how useful is that learning? Well, it turns out that when this problem was formulated in early 1970s, as I said, all the proof techniques known at that time worked perfectly in all the worlds. So when this problem was formulated, there was a lot of hope and expectation that within a few years we'll solve this. We'll prove, using existing techniques, we knew very powerful techniques. Using one of those, we'll show that P is not equal to NP. The moment this result came, it showed that none of those proof techniques are going to work. And therefore in one shot, it killed all those techniques. And as I said, at that time, every technique we knew worked perfectly in all the worlds. So suddenly, our toolbox of techniques became empty. And that was the first shock to the community that, well, this problem is not going to be so easy to solve. We have to work extra hard to solve this. Then, of course, people started looking at creating new techniques, especially keeping in mind that, okay, let's look at those proof techniques which don't work in all the worlds, because that's a precondition. And then they came up with a set of techniques. Okay, let me briefly describe. A particular technique which doesn't work in all the worlds. And that arises out of viewing computation as a circuit. See, computation, when you view it as an algorithm, it's a dynamic entity. Algorithm keeps operating on the input and keeps changing it, and there is a evolution of the system, and at the end there is an output. So there is a dynamic view of the computation. Circuits provide a static view of computation. Now, how do circuits come in? Well, if you think about a computer which is implementing or running an algorithm, the way it runs the algorithm is to transform the algorithm into a circuit, because all the computation in the computer is done through circuits. Okay, and you can't change computer depending on the algorithm. So those circuitry of the computer is fixed. So any computation has to be first translated into a fixed circuit form and then executed in a computer. So that's the circuit view of the computation, which is static. Let's forget about these descriptions. What one could show using this static view of the computation, that there is a nice equivalence between algorithms and circuits. And the form of equivalence that is of interest to us is this, that with circuits there is a notion of size associated with it. So size is the number of gates in the circuit. And the number of gates, of course, again, it will vary as the number of input lines that coming in. The more input lines come in, the larger would be the number of gates. And what one can easily establish is that a problem is in P, that is, it has an efficient algorithm, if and only if it has a circuit family of size polynomial in input size. I am calling it a circuit family because it's a static view. So the number of inputs are also fixed in a circuit. So in order to solve a problem entirely on all inputs, we need one circuit for each input size. So it's a circuit, infinite family of circuits actually. So if we can show now with this view, if a problem in NP does not have a polynomial size circuit, it would mean P is not equal to NP. And the interesting thing about this view was that this doesn't work on all the worlds. Because in a the oracle, how do you model oracle as a circuit? You can put there is an oracle gate, you can put it there. It gets some input and instantaneously comes out an output. But that oracle gate, the nature of that is going to be very different from the typical gates on a circuit. Typical gates would be AND or NOT gate. These are very simple, you can clearly describe their input-output behavior. The oracle gate is a very complex gate, very likely output behavior. So an oracle gate being present in a circuit will make the circuit very complex. Whereas if there are only simple gates present in the circuit analysis is simple. So using that we can distinguish between two types of gates. So we can arguments that work on simple gates are unlikely to work with the circuits on oracle gates. So if we can come up with nice arguments on circuits using this property of gates, that argument will not work in all the worlds. And that gave a hope that maybe using this technique we can prove P not equal to NP. And indeed, oh, by the way, this was initially in 1980s after this Baker-Gill-Solovay result. And initially there were a lot of successes, so there was a lot of hope. Again, I'll not go into the description of what these results show. Only thing is that these results showed a partial proof of P not equal to NP. They showed that there is a problem in NP which requires super polynomial size circuits of certain special kinds, not the general kind but special kinds. So they used the special property of those gates and could prove it. The bottom line is that this therefore provided us with the researchers with a path or a technique of proving P not equal to NP. Use this circuit model and work on it, derive properties of the gates using the property of gates, and then somehow use that to prove P not equal to NP. So I think like mid-80s there was a lot of excitement that okay, this is what is going to lead us to a proof. But then after mid-80s the progress stalled. Despite a large number of people working on it, they couldn't make much progress. And for 10 years, nothing happened. This led to a lot of people, everybody wondering what is happening. Have we hit another barrier that is blocking our progress? And indeed, in 94, two researchers came up with the notion of called a natural proof. Again, forget the details. What they showed was that these techniques that we have built or developed for circuit analysis, these techniques can only prove results like P not equal to NP only to an extent. Beyond that you cannot prove. And that extent has already been reached in mid-80s. So effectively they explain why after mid-80s there was no progress, because no progress was possible. And so with this result, it was realized that this work of the past 10 years in developing techniques using circuits is also not going to lead to proof of P not equal to NP. We have done what we could already using these tools. And in fact, after mid-90s, practically everybody abandoned this model of computation or attempt to use this model of computation to prove P naught equal to NP. Okay, let's skip this. So that's the second barrier that has been discovered. Now, since mid-90s, this is like 20 odd years from then, attempts have been made to find another set of techniques which avoids both these barriers. But those attempts have also not succeeded. Although I should certainly admit that number of researchers trying to do this has reduced drastically, because after failure of first two attempts, generally people realize that this is a very hard nut to crack. And so many, as it is always the case, when a problem is very hard to solve, most of the researchers then don't touch the problem. Let's forget about it, let's do something else. That is what has happened to this problem also. Very few researchers today are trying to solve this actually. And they also are trying to do it quietly so that they don't tell others, otherwise people will laugh at them. You heard the story of Fermat's last theorem? Any of you? Yeah? So this is a problem of which was open for more than 300 years. So Andrew Wiles, the mathematician who finally solved it in 1994, he started working on the problem, trying to solve this problem about 10 years ago. That is mid-80s he started working on it. But he did not tell anyone for the same reason, that people will laugh at him. He's gone, lost his mind. Why does he want to waste his time trying to solve this? So for 10 years he worked quietly and then finally solved it. So quite likely some researchers are working on trying to solve this problem, but they are not telling. So the final question that I have, and that's what I'll leave you with, is today we don't know, at least publicly, any technique. That is, our toolbox of techniques is even today empty, which is very unusual. So typically, even for a problem like Fermat's last theorem or any other problem in mathematics, the toolbox for techniques keeps getting built over time. You know, you create a tool, you create another tool, and you slowly fill up that toolbox, create a large number of tools, and eventually using that some of those tools, the problem gets solved. Now, it does take time for the toolbox to get filled, but it keeps getting filled up. Here is a problem where we started with a toolbox that got emptied, then created another set of tools that has also got emptied, and we are still looking at an empty toolbox. So in 40 years we have not built up or created any tool so far which can possibly solve this. So that's a very unique situation with this problem.
Or it is a deadlock on this.
There is no deadlock here. I mean, deadlock is when two or more entities are waiting for each other to make progress. This is not a deadlock, it is simply a situation where people are confused. That is, what is the direction to take to prove this? We don't know. Okay, any questions? So like I said earlier, this remains one of the most important unsolved problems. one of the 7 millennium problems, one of them has been solved now. So we are, as of today, we have 6 millennium problems as yet unsolved. We are like 18 years into the century. So 82 years more to go. Yes.
So what is your take on this? Is it equal or is it not equal, or it is partially supporting or partially not supporting?
I believe they are not equal.
So the results you showed, like first barrier and the first barrier, in fact the second barrier also supports the first barrier.
Second barrier is of a does similar thing.
Barrier wants to say even that second barrier also says that okay, the first barrier was true, that if it is not solving here, then it cannot be solved other.
Yeah, see, both the barriers are saying same thing about a set of techniques, that these techniques will not help. That's true. So it is conceivable, and some mathematicians have investigated it, that maybe P is not equal to NP, but we cannot prove it ever.
It is not solvable problem.
So that has been investigated also, that maybe there exists no proof. But even that investigation has not led to much success. So we are at this point, there is no clarity about does there exist a proof, can we prove it, how do we prove it, nothing is known.
Sir,
Yes.
given the fact that meta-heuristics have evolved a lot over the last 3 decades, but still people are reluctant to use them in solving the NP problems and other hard problems.
Reluctant to use what?
To use the meta-heuristics to solve NP.
Meta-heuristic. No, meta-heuristics don't provide any guarantee.
Still I am with something, I have a solution, and why not use it as some upper bound and then verify.
No, firstly, remember, this is not a problem. Meta-heuristics are used for optimization problems. This is not an optimization problem. This is a yes and no question. Okay? So, there are only 2 answers. One of them is correct. We don't know which one is correct. Now, how do you use heuristic to decide which one of these 2 is the correct answer? If your heuristic say, okay, this is the correct answer, tells me nothing, because unless I have a clinching proof that this is the correct answer, I won't believe it.
Sir, we can compare it with theory of relativity and we can show that it is not solvable. Because
It's not clear how to do that. No, there is a notion of unsolvable problems in computing, but those problems are again not of the kind which is yes and no.
not fixed. In theory of relativity,
No, that I don't see a connection here. Maybe there is, I don't know.
so sir, are there only attempts made for finding a solution or verifying a solution for this problem?
So again, this is you can only try to find a solution. See, verifying if you get a solution that you can verify. Here, the question is find a proof that P is not equal to NP.
This problem itself is an NP.
It is not, because there is no varying input size. See, problems in NP or problems in P, they are all of them have input size, different input sizes, and that's how you measure that's how you can place them in P or NP. Remember the definition of P. It says the time taken to solve the problem should vary as a polynomial in the input size. Here there is no input size. There is no variation of input size. It's just one problem. Okay, so we can't classify it in P or NP. That classification doesn't work here. All right. Thank you. Hope you like the lecture.